Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tammy Brenner, and welcome to Exploring Controlled Environmental Agriculture. Today, we are going to be looking at what controlled environmental agriculture is, take a little look at the history, look at some disadvantages and advantages, the current uses of what's going on. And Cassie's going to jump in and kind of start to show you how to start your own seeds indoors, whether you're going from indoors to outdoors or just staying indoors in a hydroponic system. And then Jake will wrap up with starting your own hydroponic system. So I believe there was a chat dropped in the box earlier to kind of let us know where you're from, what you're doing, and what your interests are. And additionally, if you have any questions or you'd like to ask in advance, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A and we can get to those. So let's get started. Slide, please, Jake. So first, important stuff, equal opportunity, access, and non-discrimination. Colorado State University is an equal opportunity provider. Colorado State University does not discriminate on the basis of disability and is committed to providing reasonable accommodations. CSU's Office of Engagement and Extension ensures meaningful access and equal opportunities to participate to individuals whose first language is not English. If you'd like to have more information on this, please scan the QR code in addition to our land acknowledgement statement. So before we get started, what is controlled environmental agriculture? I just kind of want to curious what your thoughts are. Drop them in the chat. Obviously, I just gave you some heads up, but I started playing around with AI and I wanted to ask ChatGPT what it said. So it popped up hydroponics, aeroponics, aquaponics, vertical farming, greenhouses, all pretty true. LED grow lights, climate control, automation, AI, sustainable farming, and urban farming. All sounds pretty good. This seems to me be the very broad definition of it, very common, very traditional. But if you think about it in another way, Jake, slide. They can be high-tech and low-tech systems. High-tech, like this AeroFarm Systems, it's an indoor vertical farming. It maximizes space and efficiency in year-round harvesting. It's fully automated, monitoring temperature, humidity, CO2, and light for optimal growth and yield. And then you jump over to the low-tech side, which could be a hoop house, a hobby greenhouse, anything of that style. It's basically a protection of the elements and extends the growing season. Shade covering, irrigation, roll-up sides, ventilation, maybe even an exhaust fan could be the techie side of this. It can be anything in between. It can also be, slide, it could be a house plant sitting on your windowsill, nice and warm. It's a tropical plant sitting in a windowsill, all protected from the elements. It could be mushrooms growing in your basement, nice and cool and dark. Could also be starting seeds in a Dixie cup that's protective for the environment. All of these are providing optimal growth for, or an optimal environment for growth of your plants. So yes, you are controlling the environment for agricultural growth. It's a stretch, but I think that you get the point of that. Controlled environmental agriculture has been happening forever, and it can also be very simple. Slide. Starting with the history, back in 30 AD, Roman Emperor Tiberius either was told to eat cucumbers year-round or wanted to eat cucumbers year-round. The stories were a little out there. So they developed methods of growing cucumbers year-round. One was they stuck them up against a warm side of a house or building to protect them from the elements. The other one was slightly more advanced. The specularia down on the bottom left-hand side was developed. It was basically a structure, insulated structure with lapis specularia, which is like a mica covering over the top. The plants would be stuck in there during cold but sunny days. And then they got even more advanced and stuck it on the back of a wagon, and a horse would move it back and forth to kind of give it different elements What amazing concept. I kind of want to try it myself. Then back in the 14th century, the Aztecs developed chimpananas. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it very well. And sub-irrigation systems. So you can see in the picture in the middle, it's basically crops such as corn, wheat, or corn, maize, beans were planted in low lakes or bogs or wetlands, and then a ditch was around it so that they could use they could activate it or work around it a little bit better. But the nutrient-rich soil that was from the lake bed allowed the plants to grow amazingly, and it was a new form of sub-irrigation. Fast forwarding to this century, or the 20th century, I guess, Dr. Garrick used the term hydroponic to describe plants grown in water in a laboratory setting. In the 1930s, during World War II, the US Army used hydroponics to produce food for troops. I did not know that. It was kind of interesting. You can see in this bottom right-hand corner, they actually did a really good job. It was in South Pacific Islands where the soil was not very good and healthy, so they came up with another way. In the 1950s, they started doing more viable commercial farming, but the cost of the electricity for production was just not feasible. Slide, please. So these things have been going on for years. So why is there the controlled environmental agriculture, we also called CEA, in such high demand recently? Well, with global food or global production or global population increasing, there's an increase in urbanization. Shrinking arable land is becoming more common. Water scarcity, how much do we pay for our water these days? And more severe storms have all put a higher demand on fresh quality produce, but harder to get. How many of you guys out there have had a backyard garden that was wiped out by hail in the middle of the summer? I mean, I know I have multiple times. How many of you guys live in an urban area or in a condo or in an apartment and really want to grow fresh produce, but you don't have a garden? So these are factors that are increasing the CEA demand. Slide. To have a resilient and sustainable food system, we really need to have diversity of our agriculture, scales, small and large scales, and types of agriculture available both urban and rural areas. And if you're looking at higher crop yields, there's several advantages to CEA. So they can be grown vertical in a warehouse or in a greenhouse, so you're saving up space and compacting things. Can use up to 95% less water traditional agriculture. It's gotten much better than it has years ago. You can provide year-round produce. These tomatoes were taken in January in Arizona, but it was in January. They can be grown anywhere in rural or urban areas. Reduce need for pesticides, not eliminate, but reduced. Reduce risk of foodborne pathogens and higher crop yield. You're preventing grasshoppers from eating your crop. You're preventing hail. You're providing an optimal growing environment so these plants can just produce beautiful, beautiful crops. Slide, please. There are, unfortunately, some disadvantages. There is a high capital investment. If you look at this greenhouse picture right here, this is a massive, massive greenhouse with trolley systems and mechanized scissor lifts and all sorts of high-tech systems in there. So it does have a higher energy cost. This one happens to be in Canada, so they are running their greenhouses, their lighting systems more regularly. The more technology you add, like a trolley system, the more expertise you need, and the more maintenance and monitoring that happens. But this is, I think this was in January or February, a couple of years ago in Canada. Look at how much produce it's producing. And there's still waterborne pathogens that can happen, unfortunately. Okay, slide, please. CEA commercially is readily available. Some of this might look familiar to you. Gotham Greens is located just in Windsor, Colorado, and they also have one in Denver. They produce leafy greens and like basils and a couple other herbs. Plenty had its start in Laramie, Wyoming, and they produce, this is a vertical system, they produce spring mixes. Nature Sweet, this is grown just in southern Arizona. They also have other locations, but southern Arizona. In Windset Farms, these two, which you might have seen in the grocery store, they are mainly in California and based out of Canada. Yes, it's not exactly ideal for local food production, but for Canadians that have a short growing season, this is very much local for them. Um, I don't know if you guys have ever had any of this stuff, but it's really beautiful tasting. I personally like. But let me know if you've had these and what your experience is. All right, slide please. But CEA is not just for the giant commercial people, and you don't need a huge capital investment to get started. There's ways that you guys can do it at home. This InstaFarm here, I've been playing with this the last few days. It's really kind of fun. It's super simple. It's a soil-based system. You plop in these little trays and then it waters it and monitors it. It's a very good way to start seeds. It's also a great way to just do some sprout startups. Then you can go a little next level with the Arrow Garden. You guys have probably seen this maybe on Amazon or anywhere else. You can grow 4 to 6 to 8 different herbs at a time. It comes with a light and it's a hydroponic system with solution. And then Harvest Today, this is more of a hydroponic wall, and I think Jake will talk about this a little bit earlier later. This is the next scale up, a little larger, probably or does require more expertise and knowledge about hydroponic systems, but it's not huge and it's very easily could fit into a home. Slide. In addition to the stuff that you can buy online, there is a plethora of DIY stuff that Google it, you can find, and Jake will talk more about this later, which is exciting. There's the NFT systems. It's a simple PVC piping with pumping and very straightforward. You can get this on instructables.com. There's vertical towers you could set up on the basement patio, easy to do. There's beta buckets. There's so many options out there. And luckily for us, like I said, Jake will provide some of that information later on. Slide. So at the end of the day, we looked at the history of CEA. We looked at the high-techness that it can be and also a low-tech to a hoop house and a Dixie cup. And whether or not you are going to take your starts and you're going to go outside to your garden or you're going to stay inside with a hydroponic system, it all starts with seeds. And that is what Cassey is going to talk about next. Sorry about that, Cassey.
All right. Yes, thank you, Tammy. I'm going to cover some basics that you need to know for seed starting. So let's get going. Next slide, please. All right. There are so many amazing reasons to start seeds. It is a lot more affordable to start with seeds rather than buying seedlings. You can focus in and use really hard to find species and varieties. You can work with local seed companies or specialty programs like the Seed Savers programs. You can really pinpoint your timing for planting, whether you're growing indoors or out. You have a lot more control on growth. A lot of seedlings that you buy at the nursery, they sell a little larger than they like to be transplanted. Transplanting is a stressful experience, so you can get them ready at the time when you know you will be transplanting them. If you're anything like me, it's easy to plant a few too many, and which point you then can share with friends, family, and whomever else you can pawn seedlings off onto, and it's super satisfying. I mean, anytime you start with a simple little seed and then suddenly you start seeing growth, it's just so satisfying, and it I think calls to something deeply ingrained in many of us. successfully. Next slide, please. What do you need to get started with seeds? First off, you need to figure out some kind of container to put your seeds in. You can go super, super fancy and buy a specific container like this Jiffy pot down here that is made to hold seeds and very specifically designed. It's got little channels where the water can move through, or you can use recycled containers. You can strawberry punnets are really, really good because they already have drainage holes built in. The main thing to know when you're trying to find something that you want to start seeds in is that it has good drainage and you have a way to let water move out of the soil media that the seeds are in. Next slide. What are you going to put your seedlings in? There's a lot of different things you can do. I know when you're starting seeds for hydroponic systems, you may start in different materials. This picture is focusing a little more on starting seeds potentially for transplant, but you can use a seed starting mix, which is probably the most ideal, because if you're not using something that is designed for seed starting, you may have pathogens in the mix that is going to be problematic for the seeds. It may cause problems like damping off, which I will talk about later. You can use materials like vermiculite, which holds moisture really well while still having some pore space. You can use perlite or peat moss or cocoa coir. You can make your own seed starting mixes. You can buy a seed starting mix. It's totally up to you. If you're starting for hydroponics, you can use rock wool or you can use cotton. I've been experimenting with cotton with hydroponics and it's working really well for me so far. So there's lots of different ways that you can use material for planting in, but it's going to be up to you and what your goals are as you're starting your seeds. Next slide. About this moisture. Seeds, when they are brown and dry, are in a state of dormancy, and they need some level of moisture to break that dormancy. And we need to give it to them in a way that is not going to be disruptive to their germination process. So there's several different ways that you can get moisture onto the seeds, into the media. It's always a good idea to pre-wet your soil before you mix or before you put your seeds into it. But once your seeds are planted, you want to gently water your media. You can use a mist head on a hose if you're in a greenhouse or outside. You can use a very small watering can. I like watering cans if they have kind of the the head that faces upward because it puts a gentler water onto the soil surface. Ideally, if you water from underneath, like in that Jiffy system that I showed on the what you can plant in slide, there's channels where that water can move through and move up into the bottom of the soil, watering very gently from underneath. You can also use a spray bottle. With spray bottles, you do want to be careful of water pressure. You want to twist the nozzle so that it's spraying a nice mist rather than spraying a jet that's going to move the soil around in ways that you really don't want. You want to keep those seeds fairly stable while they are germinating, especially when they first put out their cotyledons and their radicals. They can be a little bit tender, and if they get moved around too much, they're not going to grow very well. Next slide. So it can be tempting to think, okay, I've got my seeds, I'm going to need to feed them the moment I start seeing them. The wonderful thing about seeds is that the plant that made them gave them all of the things that they need to grow successfully until they start to put out their first set of true leaves. So when a seed grows, normally I have a slide on this, but I shortened this talk down. When a seed grows, it will put out one or two leaves called the cotyledons. And those are the leaves that gather enough energy for the plant to push out its true leaves. The cotyledons typically don't look like the true leaves of the plant itself. But the seed itself has all of the nutrients it needs to get to the point where it's pushed out those true leaves. So you can use a fertilizer. You can get a starter fertilizer like this one shown here that's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, 19-26-6. Notice that the first two are much higher than the last nutrient. Generally, for seedlings, you can mix a very low concentration of these. You don't need a whole lot for them when they're very small. They don't have much roots. They don't have much leaves that needs feeding. If you put too much in, you can burn them. You can cause damage to the plants. So very, very low concentrations, or mix a little bit of a slow release fertilizer into your media as you're preparing to plant your seeds. But fairly minimal on fertilizer needs until the plant starts getting going a little further. Next slide. What about light? I get this question a ton from people who are starting seeds inside, sometimes for the first time, sometimes they've been starting them for years and they just never work as well as they think they should. A big part of that is whether or not they have supplemental lighting going on their seedlings. If you are lucky enough to have a south or facing window, like on the left here, that you can make some angled shelves that get you some light, you may be able to get away with it. You might have to rotate your seedling trays a couple of times each day, or at least once every day or two, to make sure that the seedlings are growing straight rather than kind of crooked towards the light. But it can be a lot easier if you put some supplemental lighting on, like you see on the right here. You can use traditional shop lights, fluorescent bulbs. If you mix a warm bulb and a cool bulb, you can kind of simulate a fairly full range spectrum of light that is good enough for getting seedlings going in particular. But we also are in a wonderful time for lighting for all things growing plants, and you can find LED grow lights fairly affordably that are fairly inexpensive to run as well because they are quite efficient. So it's kind of up to your preference, but having some supplemental lighting can be really important. When you're thinking about how to use the lighting, making it adjustable is going to be a really good idea because you want a fairly high intensity of light fairly close to the seedlings as they're getting going. As they start to grow up, you can raise that light higher so that you're not burning your seedlings as they're growing. Next slide. There are, of course, in any time, oh, someone's asking how close supplemental light should be and for how long. Honestly, I keep supplemental lights on my seedlings until I'm ready to start hardening them off to take them outside. And if you're growing inside, they may have lights on them for the majority of their lifespan. But how close? When you're just starting getting going, you can have them even like just a few inches above the seedlings themselves. And you want to keep those lights going for you want to have some time when they are dark, but you want to have probably about 16 hours a day where they are getting lit. And of course, with any seed starting setup, you can go really basic. You can use the strawberry container with a little bit of seed starting mix and put it right next to your window and see how it all works. Or you can add in some supplemental things to help you with more guaranteed success. One of the things that really helps on that bottom picture, you can see a little plastic dome over the over the seed tray. That plastic dome is kind of a way to control your humidity and keep your moisture high in the beginning when your seeds are germinating. You want to make sure that your seeds stay nice and moist while they are in the process of germinating. If you keep that on for too long, you may start to see algae growth developing. I'll talk about that on my last slide as well. Another thing that can help, I don't know if you're like me and you keep your house fairly cool to save on heating costs, but a heat mat like in the top there can be a really good way to help get good germination. A lot of seeds, even our cool season plants, they like to germinate warm and then grow cool. Peppers can germinate, they can like getting temperatures even up to the high 70s and 80 degrees to help encourage rapid germination. There are some heat mats for seeds that you can get that you can even program what temperature you want them to be at. Or you can buy the general ones you get at the big box stores, I think usually go to about 80 or 85 degrees. You can also invest in some timers so that you can have that light on that 16 hours on and 8 hours off kind of schedule. And make sure that you have some labels. This is somewhere where my gardening hubris has bitten me several times because I'm like, oh, I'm planting this here. I know what I planted. I'm going to remember. And I never do. So make sure that you label in a way that is consistent and that you know exactly what you're planting so that you remember for once it comes time to either transplant it up or put it into its final home. Next slide. All right. What about planning your schedule? I've heard numerous people already who say, oh, I've got my tomatoes, they're up, they're about 3 inches tall. I can't wait to get them in the ground. And I look at my clock and my watch and I'm like, well, for tomatoes growing outside, you really don't want to plant them just yet because they're going to be really big by the time you get to our last frost date and warm enough temperatures. If you start too soon, those plants are going to get overgrown. But if you start too late, your plants just might not have enough of a root system to transplant successfully. Or if you start way too late, then you might not get tomatoes before we get a freeze. So if you are planning to plant out or to transplant to outside, some important dates to be aware of are the last frost date and the first frost date. It sounds backwards, but the last frost date is in the springtime and the first frost date is in the fall. Usually here along the Front Range, our last frost date is somewhere between mid-May and Memorial Day. We almost always get snow on Mother's Day, which is mid-May. And then the first frost date you will have somewhere in early October. So from that, you can kind of calculate when is a good timing to start your seeds. Next slide. When you're indoor planting, you use, like I said, those frost dates. You also use days to germination to determine how long you need to take before the seedling will come up, and then how long until the seedling develops to the point where you can transplant it, and the days to maturity for when to start inside. So how does this all translate? Let's go to the next slide and look at the schedule. Generally speaking, for seedlings, cucumbers, melons, squash, and lettuce, if you are starting them inside, is about a 2 to 4 week lead time. Broccoli, Brussels sprout, cabbage, cauliflower, and tomatoes is a 5 to 7 week lead time for when you want to be starting them. Eggplant, leeks, and onions and peppers, 6 to 9 weeks. And if you are seeding flowers, you're looking at sometimes up over 10 weeks. Before you can put them outside. So you'll count back on your calendar, and I'll give you on the next slide an example of how to do that. So I'm going to start with tomato because it's everybody's favorite, even though it's the princess of the garden. Generally speaking, tomatoes take 1 to 2 weeks to germinate. They take about 6 weeks to go from germination to a seedling that is a good size for transplant. Which then means that your total seedling time is 7 to 8 weeks, because germination is not always counted in that days to maturity time. Then from seedling to maturity, you've got about 11 weeks. Sometimes when you are transplanting, you might have a little bit of a setback in your growth. So it might be a little bit longer than this basic math shows. And because we have erratic climate in Colorado, sometimes it can take even longer here. Next slide. Okay. And then this one, I will probably talk the longest, but this is my last big main slide, going over some common problems that people have with seed starting and how you can solve them. So if you are seeing algae growth, if you're seeing green stuff on the surface of your media, that likely means that you either have too much moisture or too little airflow. So you need to reduce that moisture in some way. One thing you can do is you can take off any kind of humidity dome that you had on. Another thing that you can do is you can add some airflow. You can put a fan on your seedlings. A fan on seedlings does so many good things for them. It helps them create more cell wall strength, and it also helps move the air so you don't have as much potential for disease development, and you help get that air off of the surface of the soil. If you're seeing fungal growth on the surface, so like gray fuzzy stuff, that's also probably due to too much moisture. So reducing how much you water, letting that media dry out a little bit in between irrigation instances is probably going to be one of your best bets. If you're seeing seedlings come up, they're starting to look really good. Maybe you're seeing a little hint of a true leaf popping in from the cotyledons. Oops. What could be happening is, and then one day all of a sudden it just kind of topples over, and you see a little pinch at the surface of the soil. That's likely a fungus that we call damping off. It's Unfortunately, there's no way to solve it once it's happened, but for future instances of planting your seedlings, you can use a sterile soil or you can sterilize your own soil. I've seen people who like to keep their soil and not buy it over and over. They will use a solar oven or something like that to sterilize their soil outside. You don't want to sterilize soil in your own home oven. It gets smelly. Trust me, not a pleasant thing to do. Um, Next up, if you've got seedlings and they are growing and they're stretching up, maybe they're getting so long that they're kind of flopping over, it is a good indication that you probably have insufficient light. If you do have supplemental light on them, you probably want to lower that light down, get it fairly close. I had one colleague who would always say, you want it to pretty much be touching the leaves. That sometimes can be a little close, especially with really bright LEDs that we use now, but very close to the seedlings themselves. If you do not have any supplemental light, that might be your indication of maybe you should try try and get some light on there. Once seedlings have become very, very tall like that, it can be a little tricky to backtrack from it and to get them growing strongly. But if you catch it early enough and get that light down, then you definitely can have some success there. Finally, if your seed packet gets wet, or if you know that your seeds are very old, most seed packets will tell you the year that they were packaged for. A lot of vegetable seeds remain viable very well for the first 5 or so years, but they may start to not work quite as well after that. You can always do a test germination. To do a test germination, you want to take your seeds, count out about 10 of them if you've got enough. Put them in a damp paper towel in some kind of sealed container, a Ziploc bag, or I like to use a Tupperware container, and leave them in there for about a week. If you start to see any mold or anything growing, maybe crack the lid or crack the bag just a little bit to get some airflow in there. Then once you start to see them germinating, you can count. If you have 5 out of the 10 that have germinated, you know you probably just need to plant double. Um, if almost none of them are coming up, it may be time to go and buy a new set of seed packets. If you have seedlings that are yellow, and depending where it is on the plant, you may have a problem with either nutrients or with lights. If the cotyledons themselves are yellow, it's more likely that it is a light issue because those cotyledons should be pulling nutrients from the seed itself, the germ of the seed. They should not be yellowing until the true leaves have grown enough to start producing food for the plant, at which point the cotyledons will yellow and drop off. If they're yellow from the very get-go, it could be a light issue. If you're seeing yellowing on the new growth itself, it's more likely that it's some kind of nutrient issue, and putting a very light fertilizer on there may be a good place to start with troubleshooting to figure out where you're at. And those are, somebody asked if different seed suppliers are better than others. There are some companies that are sometimes less reliable, but the big ones fairly often are pretty reliable. They have professionals who test all of their seeds to have guaranteed germination rates. By and large, any of the really big companies are going to be great at providing good seeds. And if you do have issues, you can often reach out to them and say, hey, I bought X and Y seed this year. I grew them as I normally do, and they just weren't working. And they might reach out and give you some suggestions or send you a new set of seeds. And so that's what I had for you for today on seed starting. Hopefully that's helpful. If there's more
Thanks,
questions, I'm
Cassey.
happy to answer.
All right, I'll be stepping in now. My name is Jake. I manage the Metro Ag Research Center for Colorado State University, housed here in Denver. So I'm be talking a little bit about kind of practically starting hydroponic systems. So before I really got involved in horticulture, back when I was in high school, I used to think hydroponic systems were like building a spaceship or something, that it was super complex and really confusing. And the reality is it's pretty simple, but it's also exciting because there's a really high ceiling for how in depth you can get with these things, but there's also a pretty easy adoption curve. So you can be pretty successful even if it's your first time with hydroponics. If you start with the basics and just stick to them, I guarantee you'll have a great time. And I'll just walk you through the kind of main hydroponic systems that we see used commercially, and then how we can modify those for home use, and discuss kind of the basics of managing these systems. So fundamentally speaking, all we're doing is delivering oxygenated water to the root zones of plants. And so we have a couple of different ways of doing it. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's just making sure plants have nice flowing oxygenated water in their root zone. So kind of my favorite intro system to use is called deep water culture. You'll see it abbreviated DWC for short. Picture it on the right. There's a little about an inch of styrofoam with some holes in it, and plants that are put through the styrofoam so that the bottom of it contacts the water. So they just float in kind of a lazy river, if you will. And in general, we pump air. So we like to use air pumps and air stones a lot, like the aquarium industry does. So an aquarium pump works great for these. Plants just sit on top, and we bubble air through the water, and that keeps things healthy, flowing, and oxygenated. These systems work really great for stuff like leafy greens, stuff that's pretty quick to turn over, really easy to grow herbs, kind of stuff that doesn't grow too big. These systems have a little bit of issues when it comes to plants that get really big and really heavy. So you can see in this picture that the overall hole size that you're planting into is only about a square inch for most of these things. You can make them bigger. They have these devices called net cups, which are kind of our hydroponic pots, if you will. And you can make these systems bigger to hold larger plants. However, as the plants get heavier, they're going to draw the raft down. And so in general, we like to do these kind of what we call quick turn leafy greens. So your lettuces, spinaches, basils, that kind of stuff that you can mature in about a month or two, and harvest in these systems. The great part about deep water culture is that it's less prone to any kind of problems or errors you have with your mechanics of your system. So since the plants are actively sitting in a pool of water, if your air pump breaks, it usually takes about 3 or 4 days before the water gets really stagnant and loses oxygen. So you have a lot of time to fix those problems, and the plants are never going to run out of water, which is great. So live question, is this what Gotham Greens uses? So if I'm not mistaken, they have a little bit of both. So they have this one, and they have this one right here, which is nutrient film technique. I believe that their new Windsor facility is deep water culture, but their kind of legacy Denver facility, which is in Aurora, uses nutrient film technique. So a little bit of both, kind of show you that depending on how you set up your systems, one can be, even the commercial growers play around with both. So for nutrient film technique, what we're doing is we're pumping water. So in this system, you can see these black lines going into these gutters. You can use a vinyl gutter like you have at home, around your roofs. There's certain companies out there like Hort Americas or Crop King that produce these that are a little bit more specialized for actual horticultural production. But the idea is that you're just running a stream of water underneath the plants, and they're soaking it up from the bottom, and growing from there. So these systems tend to be pretty good for a larger variety of plants. Generally, leafy greens is still preferred, but you can grow larger potted plants in these as well. You can actually put just a plant pot into one of these gutters and have it grow reasonably well as well. So with both deep water culture and nutrient film technique, how you have your starter plug is kind of important because it has to fit within the system itself. And what I mean by that is they make specific plugs. So like Jiffy plugs are an example. You might see plugs called rapid rooters. And these are plugs that are generally either contained in a paper wrapper or have a binder, like a cellulose binder, to kind of keep things held together. If you use just like a peat moss based potting mix, that can get washed away or it can fall through and you can have some issues holding your plants up in these systems. That can be solved with net pots, as I mentioned earlier. But something to consider that if you're going to be using this deep water culture or nutrient film technique system, how you start your plants can be important for that process. Nutrient film technique within the horticultural environment tends to have a little bit higher yields than deep water culture. If you're a small scale homeowner, it's a difference between, 1 head of lettuce, or I should say like 6 heads of lettuce versus 7. So it's generally not a big deal. And the bigger deal, in my opinion, both commercially and at home, is nutrient film techniques can be a little bit trickier to clean and kind of reset. for your next time you have these gutters that you got to wipe out, you're always going to get a little algae growth with these. So the gutters tend to be a little bit more work to clean. And that's why we see commercial growers kind of switch back and forth, because as they balance their labor costs with their productivity, sometimes having a less labor system that's a little bit less productive is better. But both of these work great. We've used both of these in our greenhouse upstairs here at the Metro Ag Research Center. So both really good systems, both easy to set up. And I would say the biggest difference between the two is in the deep water culture, you have more water and you have a air pump to oxygenate. And then in your nutrient film technique, you have less water on the exact growing area itself, and you're having a water pump pump that water over. So air pump versus water pump, kind of volume of water is the major differences there. As I mentioned with the deep water culture system, the disadvantage to nutrient film technique is if your pump breaks, if you leave for work in the morning and your pump breaks and your plants are out in the sun all day, they can be cooked by the time you get home, because the amount of water that's actually available to them at any given period of time is small. So that's where it can be a little bit more nerve-wracking or high risk with these systems. You have to make sure that your pumps are well maintained and flowing, but they're really simple to set up and a great way to grow plants. The next one is container and substrate systems. So these come in a bunch of different forms. Tammy mentioned beta buckets. So this is a pepper crop I did on my back porch a couple years back. These are sold through Crop King. Once like the NFT system, we're using a water pump to deliver water over the top. It flows through this out of a drainage hole and then recirculates back to the main reservoir. So once again, it's just recirculating water through each of these pots continuously. Like the deep water culture system, the great part about these container systems is that these pots do hold water. So if you do have a pump break, you got a bit of time, depending on how big your plants are and how much water they're soaking up, to find that problem and solve it. So in this particular case, with these plants you're seeing on the screen, it would take about 2 days before they'd really dry down and you'd have to worry about them losing too much water. So it's a great system to, if you have worried about whether your pump's going to break or not, gives you a little bit of time to do that as well. Not only that, but you can set up these systems to directly pot plants in. So you can go to a garden center. As I mentioned, like the previous two systems, the substrate you start in can be important for their success in the system. For a beta bucket system like this, you can go to any garden store, buy any kind of plant you want, pot it in there, put it on hydroponics, you're good to go. So these substrate systems tend to be a little bit more flexible in what you put in them. With that being said, the media that you fill these pots with, by media I mean like potting mix or soil, which isn't true soil. We generally prefer really, really light and airy mixes. So that's like vermiculite. I personally like coconut coir a lot, like a really coarse coconut coir that you can buy at various garden centers or hydroponic shops. You want a little bit better water flow. So with this continual water system going into these container and substrate systems, you want to make sure that the drainage is good and you don't have water pool up and spill out the top of your container. And so for that, we like to use really light and airy mixes. What you plant into that doesn't necessarily have to be a light and airy mix, so long as the rest of the pot can maintain that good drainage. So those three, deep water culture, nutrient film technique, and container substrate systems, are kind of the three main categories of systems, if you will. With that being said, there's a little bit of potential to combine these things. So you could set up a substrate system directly above your reservoir where the water drips directly down into it, and the roots can then grow through the bottom of the pots down into the reservoir. So it's almost like a deep water culture and a substrate system. You could put them in a gutter and do the same thing. And so you kind of have a combination between an NFT and a substrate system. So I'll just say that like you can have a lot of fun when you're designing these things at home. When you get kind of a knack for what works and what doesn't. You can make them super complex. You can make them super simple. You can make them fit where you need them to fit with the right form factor and conform to really what you want them to do. So those are kind of the main categories, if you will. But how you set up an individual system should really be set up for your specific setup and what you want to see out of it, as well as the requirements that you need, whether it's reliability, whether it's speed of growth, whether it's form factor, all those kind of things can be customized. So you can have a lot of fun designing and building these systems. So the last thing I'm going to mention is aquaponics. Aquaponics is a combination of aquaculture and hydroponics. So with the idea that you feed fish, fish produce waste, that waste gets processed by microbes into available nutrients, and then that nutrient composition is basically a hydroponic fertilizer. And I'll talk a little bit more about fertilizers here in a minute. But the idea that you have like aquaculture providing your fertilizer, and then you have a hydroponic system growing your plants. I view this as a little bit separate because an aquaponic system can be paired with any hydroponic system. So as we discussed before, it can be paired with deep water culture, it can be paired with container systems. With the container stuff, you do have to worry a little bit about how your substrate affects water chemistry, but coconut coir generally works well for that too. So not a whole bunch of concerns as long as you're making sure your fish are at the right pH and get fed well. I'll just say that I view these as kind of a fertilizer production system, that at least the aquaculture side, that then feeds into the hydroponic side. These can be a lot of fun. We have koi here in our greenhouse that provide fertilizer for our plants. It could be a great thing to set up, and you can do it. The nice part of aquaponics is a lot like hydroponics. You can do it a bunch of different ways. You can grow everything from fish to shrimp to crawdads and snails. But yeah, so just to mention that if you've heard aquaponics, it does exist, and it's a way of producing fertilizer for really any kind of hydroponic system. So I'm going to take a question real quick. So among these systems, does the nutrition for humans, the end, fluctuate? How do producers calculate nutrition for hydroponics? Is this different from in-earth growth? So I have a little bit of an opinion on this. So I've done research with this during my PhD, and it's an excellent question. So let me start from the top and say that the nutrition of plants is mainly going to be driven by what variety of plant you're growing. So if you grow, a variety of, there's going to be more differences between a red leaf lettuce and a green leaf lettuce than a red leaf lettuce grown outside and a hydroponic red leaf lettuce. So the varietal differences a lot of times are huge drivers of nutrition. The kind of caveat or exception to that is that a lot of times adversity can develop nutritional compounds. So when a plant experiences cold stress or heat stress or drought stress, they can create compounds that are nutritious for us. And this is especially apparent in the brassica world. And brassicas are your kales, mustard greens, Brussels sprouts, there's a whole bunch of them. And the more you stress them out, the more of that bitter kind of astringent flavor you're going to get out of them. And a lot of times that's correlated with nutritional compounds. Within controlled environment agriculture, we try to avoid adverse conditions to give our plants the best growing environment. And sometimes that can result in lower concentrations of specific nutrients. Not always all of them, but really the ones related to those stress responses. So that's a big difference there. And then if you want my personal opinion from like my life standpoint, when I grow plants hydroponically, they're in front of me and I like to eat them. And I'm a big grazer. I love having hydroponic systems at home that I can just graze leaves off of. So in my opinion, the growing stuff hydroponically indoors makes me eat food. And if you eat healthy produce, you're going to get the nutrition off of it. It's better than not eating healthy produce. So it's a great question. It's a little bit of a caveated answer. And at the end of the day, I think that whatever system works for you to eat plants that are healthy and good for you is the one you should go with. But there are some differences based on kind of what I mentioned before on varieties and the kind of adverse conditions. I'll take one more question real quick. In the past, I tried to grow in the grocery store and hydroponics without success. Is there a trick for just not grown in soil well? I don't know specifically. A lot of times, if you buy a plant from a grocery store from like the produce section, they may be towards the end of their successful life, not necessarily in the best condition to reroot and grow. But I can let others kind of comment in on there if Tammy, Cassey, or Chris have more to say on that. All right, so those are the main kinds of hydroponic systems. Go into a little bit more practical stuff for you to try at home. So we use a lot of these HDX buckets. They're pretty cheap. They're pretty easy to modify. And with a little bit of styrofoam in there and an air pump, we can make them into a nice deep water culture system for us to grow plants in. In addition, we've taken the lids and we've drilled holes in them and just used normal nursery pots. And for this, we used some recycled glass stones, but you could use coconut coir or clay pellets or any sort of substrate for this. And then we put a water pump in to pump it over the top. So this is two easy ways to convert a easy tote into a hydroponic system, and both of these have worked really well. So for fertilizer, we use a fertilizer called Jax 51226 and calcium nitrate. It's a two-part fertilizer. And so for this specific setup, the ratio is 1.5 to 1 of each, and that's for about a 3-gallon mix. And so for about a 9-gallon working volume of container, it's only about 4.5 teaspoons of the 51226 and 3 teaspoons of calcium nitrate. So that works really well for our hydroponic systems. It's kind of just an easy, you buy a 12-gallon bucket, set it up like this, buy that, add it in there, and in general, you're pretty successful. So we had some fun with this the other day in my lab, and we made some, the other day, meaning last year, we made some custom hydroponic systems that we tried out. So on the left, you can see kind of how they're built. So we had some ones where we did just deep water culture, some ones where we did a little bit of a combination of both, small pots, big pots. And you can see, and kind of as I mentioned earlier, you can set these up in a lot of different ways, and you can see that we were successful in just about every single different attempt that we set up. So a lot of flexibility, a lot of fun to be had in terms of designing and building these things. And you can see in 3 weeks, we went from little seedlings to big plants. Lettuce was ready to go. The tomatoes were setting fruit. So it's really cool to see this stuff happen pretty quickly. If you're not a DIYer, and Tammy had mentioned some of these before, there's a lot of great options out there for you to purchase and try out. So we mentioned the Harvest Today system. They're out of Broomfield. They come in different sizes and form factors. They're more of like if you want to grow all of your leafy greens, they're a great system to do that with. The next one over is Garden, Gardyn. These are kind of almost grows all your leafy greens kind of systems. It's plug and play, and it includes lights as well. So this is a great system to be able to buy and stick stuff in. Crop King makes a small countertop unit, just a little tiny 8-plug NFT system. That's a lot of fun. And then Aero Gardens, and I don't really know what to call Aero Gardens. It's somewhere between a substrate and deep water culture water recycling system, but it works great. It comes with the light as well. And so the Aero Garden and the garden system, both the garden systems, if you will, come with lights, which is really nice. And then the Crop King and Harvest Today don't, but for someone like me, that's great because I get to do the custom lighting as well. With each of these systems, I'll just put a plug out there that they do come with their own like pre-bought seed starters that you can just stick in there and go. But you can also start seeds just like Cassey told you to and put them in these systems as well. Tends to be a little bit cheaper if you do it that way. And you can be just as successful. So they're great systems to use for that reason too. So a little bit into how to manage your water chemistry within hydroponic systems, and hope this doesn't scare anyone. It's pretty simple and straightforward. We have 2 things that we're looking for. One is pH, which is how acidic and basic the water is. The other is electrical conductivity, which is just how much fertilizer you add to your water. So in the previous example where I showed you the 4 teaspoons and 3 teaspoons, if you added twice as much, your EC would be twice as high. So it's just telling you about how much fertilizer to add. Fertilizer is one of those things that more is not always better. You want to add the right amount. And so EC lets us do that. pH, on the other hand, affects availability. So plants have a specific pH that works really well for them to take up the nutrients that they want. Any lower or any higher, they can struggle to take up certain nutrients depending on what pH you're at. So in general, for pH, we like it between 5.6 and 6.2, with 5.8 being ideal for most plants. Strawberries like it a little bit higher, blueberries like it a little bit lower. But for most leafy greens, tomatoes, that kind of stuff, we're right in that 5.6 to 6.2 range. For electrical conductivity, we measure it in a unit called millisiemens per centimeter. It's a conductivity measurement, so the more conductive something is, the higher that number is. It's kind of a funky unit, but just to put it in perspective, 1.8 is generally what you look for when you're measuring with the probes I'm going to go over in a minute. Really, really hungry crops like tomatoes, and I know poinsettias is also one of these really hungry crops too. You can boost that up to as high as sometimes 3, sometimes a little bit above that. But with that being said, most everything grows great at 1.8. So that's generally, at least at my house where I run everything at. Seedlings, like a little bit lighter. So 0.8 to 1.2 is good for them as well. And just for reference, tap water here in Colorado tends to be between 0.1 and 0.3, which is fantastic. There's other parts of the country where it's as high as 0.8 just out of the tap. And that comes from the hard water, the little bit of calcium and sodium and stuff that's in our water systems, just naturally. So the way we measure this, and this is going to kind of be the scary slide because there's some high prices on here, but just hang on. There's some cheaper ways to do this. We like having Blue Lab measurement probes. So this is a probe where we have one button, we press pH, one button does the EC, and then we can just stick those in our reservoirs and see if we need to adjust the pH. And we can do that by adding something like citric acid or baking soda to kind of move the pH around. Or if we need to add more fertilizer, if the EC is too low, or add more water if the EC is too high. So this is kind of our tool that we use to do that. There's a bunch of other ones on the market. Blue Lab is just one that is really consistent. Henna makes some. Atlas Scientific makes some. So there's a bunch of different suppliers out there. My big take-home message with this is you get what you pay for. So if you find a $20 EC and pH probe, chances are it's not very accurate and it's not going to last very long. Generally, there's no reason to go any higher than the Blue Labs price. It's kind of the premium one, if you will, but it's super reliable, super consistent, and we like it a bunch. If you want to go with something cheaper, though, we do have indicator dyes and test strips that are available. And for those things, it's a couple of bucks. Something like $10 or $20 can last you a year or more. I know I've had bottles of this stuff last multiple years if you're really, really conservative with it. And then for EC, like I said, it comes down to how well you're measuring out your fertilizer. So if you're just accurately measuring your fertilizers and your plant's looking great, a lot of times you can just kind of blow over EC. It's not recommended commercially, but as a homeowner, anything, like I mentioned, a 0.8 EC will a lot of times grow plants really well. A 2.8 EC will also grow most plants pretty well. So you're a couple order magnitude different there. So as long as you're really accurate with how you're measuring your fertilizers and applying them, you can kind of get away with skipping EC. And then if you use pH dyes or test strips, you can really reduce the price of testing for that as well. So yeah, so I hope with that, you've learned a bit, and yeah, happy to take any questions that people have and turn it back over to Tammy and Cassey as well. And I guess we can go over to the Q&A. Plants do not take up lead in the water, correct? Tammy and Cassey, do you have? I can answer that unless you have more specific stuff at the top of your head.
Go for it, Jake.
Go for it.
So I can tell you that for a lot of gardeners that are worried about stuff like lead in soils, most of the contamination occurs when you're actually working in the soil itself and that dust gets on the plant, and then you then eat that as well. So that's actually the main objective or the main concern when it comes to growing plants in leaded soils. Generally speaking, plants don't take up the large amounts of lead. However, it is species specific. There are some crops that are really good at taking up lead. Those tend to be like grasses or hemps or stuff like that. They can be really good in a process called bioremediation. Most of our vegetable crops, especially the ones that are fruiting crops, for the lead to get from the soil through the plant to the fruit is a really tough process for that to occur. So like in general, you're not going to see a whole lot of that happen. With that being said, like we see most, like I mentioned before, we see most of that problem with windblown dust getting like set into things as opposed to the plant uptaking it. Any concerns with water temperature? Yes. So water temperature, as I mentioned before, oxygenation is important for maintaining good hydroponic systems. The warmer water is, the less oxygen it can hold. So in general, if you keep your water temperature below 82 degrees and above about 60 degrees, your plant will go fine. And that's a pretty wide range. So indoor temperatures works great. Outdoors, as long as your reservoir isn't in direct sunlight, you're generally pretty good. There are some kind of advanced levels tricks you can do with water temperature. For example, lettuce and spinach can be really fussy in warm temperatures. And so keeping their water temperature cold can help you avoid lettuce bolting, and it can avoid spinach catching certain diseases and doing weird things. But in general, kind of a water temperature that's less than 82 degrees and higher than 60, you'll be successful. Well, great. I don't see any other questions online. I can turn it back over to Tammy.
Great, thank you, Jake. That was super informative. Every time I learn more about hydroponics, I get way more excited than I was before. If there are no other questions, or if you happen to think of questions later on, you can always email us at the email on the screen. And we should be hosting, Jake, actually, aren't you hosting a hydroponic workshop here soon at Spur?
We are, yes. I need to look at that. I am out of town when that's going on, so I'm not hosting it, but there is one going on at Spur. I think we're scheduling it for the end of April. So last week of April, you can keep your eyes open for that, and we'll have more offerings in the fall as well.
Great, thanks, Jake. That would be if you guys are around or interested in attending any of the in-person webinar or in-person workshops, let us know, because we're always happy to share what we all know. And also, learning hydroponics and greenhouses and plants are always much easier in person when you can touch things. So with that, if you guys don't have any more questions, I will let you guys go, but feel free to reach out to us anytime, and we would be happy to have a longer conversation. Great, thank you, bye.